It has happened. People are making a lot of comparisons. There are two very, very different events with, of course, after 1989. I mean, the silent revolutions of the late 80s. And there have been other such events, the Soviet system. I grew up in Latin America. Dictatorships came down not because a superior military power brought them down. And there is clearly something in the way we think and in the theories we have about how revolutions happen or how you bring down great powers that doesn't quite accommodate the possibility that unarmed people, but you need masses, and I would argue you need cities. I don't know what that would be like without cities. That unarmed people can actually contest military power, tanks, guns, etc. Not always, clearly. There were 300 dead at least, and we know there will be more. There are probably more that we haven't counted. But there is an interesting dynamic, and to me it is really also a heuristic moment. It illuminates possibilities. It tells us something about the conditions for change. It takes courage, it takes organizing, it takes discipline, it takes a lot of things. This does not fall from the sky, but it can happen even against a very powerful regime that, of course, we have armed. I must now thank, this is always part of the story here, thank our sponsors and co-sponsors, Committee on Global Thought, of course, the Heyman Center for the Humanities, Columbia-Paris Alliance Program, Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies, and the Middle East Institute. We thank you a lot. Now what I propose is I will introduce all the speakers right away so that we don't interrupt the flow, if you want. And I've asked Juan Cole, who will speak first, to address sort of the larger and yet generic, because they recur over time, they recur across place, conditions and processes, dynamics that we see at work here. The second speaker is Jean-Pierre Filiu, and he will talk about the larger landscape of the Arab and Muslim world, especially around the Mediterranean. The third speaker we had organized was Mona El-Ghobashy, a historian who will talk to us about, if you want, earlier histories of protest in Egypt. And then finally, Rashid Khalidi, who will talk to us, or I've asked him to talk, I don't know exactly what he's going to talk about, the larger tactical and strategic issues in the region. I have long bios for each of these speakers, but since we started late, I would rather, it will be all on the website. They all have written books that we ought to read, that are worth. They all have distinguished careers. Some are younger, some are older, some are at the beginning of distinguished careers. And I hope none of the speakers minds that I don't dwell on bios and that we just go to the heart of the matter here. Thank you very much. Juan.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Saskia, and to all of you for coming out, to Akil Bilgrami and Rashid Khalidi and others for inviting me here. Let me begin with a little levity. It's a dark situation, but you know, the Egyptians are the stand-up comedians of the Middle East. I even have heard about a Lebanese woman who wanted to marry an Egyptian man so that she could laugh the rest of her life, because they're very inventive about jokes. And of course, they have a lot of tragedy in their lives, and so this is one of the ways they deal with it. But the joke is that, you know, Mubarak, Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, came to power on the assassination of Anwar al-Sadat in 1981. And he's 82. So he's been there a very long time, and he's getting on in years. So Mubarak's advisors come to him and they say, this is before the recent crowd actions, they say, Mr. President, don't you think it's time to say goodbye to the Egyptian people? And the joke is that Mr. Mubarak got this look of absolute astonishment on his face. He was just surprised more than anything else. And he said, why? Where are they going? And you know, in the Egyptian jokes, there's much wisdom. So we saw that joke play out this afternoon. My suspicion is that Mr. Mubarak was talked to by the other officers in the military, because you know he's actually an Air Force Marshal. And they let him know that it's time for him to say goodbye to the Egyptian people. And he probably sort of grimly nodded or something, gave them the impression that they'd gotten through to him. And then he went on television and announced that no, he was still going to be there. So why is all this happening now, and what exactly is the phenomenon that we are seeing? We are assured by people down the street a little bit from television studios that this is the beginning of the Islamic Caliphate. And no, that hypothesis is incorrect. So what is it? Well, it is a labor action. This is a labor revolution. And you know, it's a good time for me to bring up the great sociologist and historian Chuck Tilley, who wrote quite a lot about revolutions. And if he were with us still, he would be telephoning me to get details, because he'd have a theory of it, what's going on in Egypt. And Chuck Tilley said that all revolutions are multiple revolutions, several revolutions taking place at the same time. And certainly that's going on in Egypt. There is a white-collar revolution. I can't tell you how many office workers there are in Egypt. Egypt is a country with a big public sector where there are many, many offices, and where people are paid and treated very poorly. So what we would think of as white-collar workers. But interestingly enough, these white-collar workers, A, are often unionized, and B, they have sympathies with the blue-collar workers and their unions. And the unions I'm talking about are not the official unions of the National Democratic Party, because Egypt, you know, like the old Soviet Union, has official unions that are actually intended to control the workers rather than allow them to express themselves. Rather, these are wildcat unions. They are unions formed in defiance of the regime. And on January 29th, I don't believe you would be easily able to find any television or possibly even radio broadcast which mentioned this. But on January 29th, 4 days after the current round of protests began, these informal unions, who had called for strikes in support of the demonstrations, formed an umbrella group, the Federation of Egyptian Trade Unions. And so this is a remarkable development of cross-class worker solidarity that's going on here. And not only are the white-collar workers and the blue-collar workers, at least very large numbers of them, coordinating, cooperating in this movement, but then they have the sympathy and support of many members of the new middle class in Egypt, of college students, recent college graduates, because of course what faces many of them is poorly paid office jobs, so they are sympathetic to the complaints of their predecessors. And you know, the American media goes wild about the new middle class, about the college students, about Twitter and Facebook, and that's what we hear a lot about in this country. And we no longer, you know, mention the word union very much. Indeed, screenwriters from Hollywood have talked in their memoirs about being instructed not to mention the word union in their screenplays. So the corporate dominance of media in the United States is such that there's very little reporting on major strikes in this country, and then that extends to our coverage of the Middle East. So who knows that there have been 3,000 strikes in Egypt since 2004? Who knows that Egypt has gone from being a country that was largely agricultural, because you know traditionally it was a big cotton farm, to being a country where 25% of the economy is in the industrial sector. And that economic and demographic structural change is a very important background for these strikes. We also hear a lot about the demonstrations in Tahrir Square, in Liberation Square in downtown Cairo. And that is a very significant site. It's a place where Egyptian crowds have gathered. They gathered there in the time of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the great nationalist leader of the 50s and 60s, to commemorate his fiery speeches. It is a place where the Mugama, the offices that are in charge of bureaucratizing people and routinizing them and controlling them, are there. And so when you protest against the government in Liberation Square, you're protesting right at the scene of the government control of you. So I don't mean to take anything away from the courage and the energy and the dynamism of the crowds at Tahrir Square. That's where, to the extent that our major media, television media, are reporting, they're reporting mainly from there. But this is a nationwide movement. And it cannot be understood only as a movement of downtown Cairo. There have been very significant crowd actions, protests, rallies, even attacks on police stations all around the country. And sometimes the police stations have been set fire to out in Suez or in other provincial towns in Damanhur and so forth. There have been very major rallies in Alexandria, the port city on the Mediterranean. Yesterday, the workers in Asyut, which is a city in the south of the country, in Upper Egypt, coordinated to cut off the city from Cairo. And they blocked the main road, and they also stopped the rails from running, and they brought palm trees and set them afire as barricades. So they were using peasant techniques of protest, and probably some of them are peasants and not just urban workers. And of course, you know, in Egypt, the difference between an urban and a rural worker is on a spectrum, because much of Egypt, in much of Egypt, the cities give way to the countryside gradually, and some former villages, you know, end up being incorporated as a kind of suburb into the major cities. I'm sure Saskia will have more to say about that kind of thing. So this is a movement that is occurring all over the country, and I guarantee you that none of those 4,000 workers that cut the road and the railroad and brought the palm trees and set them on fire as barricades has a Twitter account. And as a historian, I just have to remind the journalists who go wild about the new media that, you know, in 1776, certain things happened here in New York in the absence of electronic means of communication. Gossip turns out to be a very effective way of getting up a revolution. And just telling other people in your social networks about it. And you'll note that when the government cut off Facebook and Twitter, apparently they bought this line that that's what it's all about, and they thought, well, we'll just get rid of it. Those were when the biggest demonstrations occurred. So word of mouth can get around in various ways. Facebook and Twitter are useful tools. They're useful networking tools. They can be put to lots of different purposes, and it is true that, you know, if each person has 200 friends and associates, and you can get a hold of one of them, then they tell the other 200. This can build word of mouth very effectively, but it's nice. It's not necessary. The Iranian Revolution of 78-79 was promulgated in some large part by cassette tapes. You know, in the old days, for the younger in the audience, there used to be this magnetic tape that they would wind it around a plastic container. So they would put those, there was a machine in the car that you would put them in, and you could listen to them. So if you got in a taxi in 1978 in Tehran, the taxi driver would put in Khomeini's sermon. And if you told him to turn it off, you were a Pahlavi supporter. If you didn't, then Khomeini's sermon got through to you, and these were all spread around. So, and in the Chinese events of the the late 80s that culminated in the Tiananmen Square crackdown, fax machines were very important. So yes, you know, the new media, the electronic media are important. They can be useful. They're not a sine qua non. People can get up revolutions in all kinds of ways. The really important issue, it seems to me, and the thing that I think the focus on the new media elides and tries to get around is, what is the interest here? Because American public discourse, and even a lot of American social science, favors consensus models of society in the Talcott-Parsons mode rather than interest theories of conflict. And you know, you can't really blame the social scientists in America too much for this, because the United States is remarkably quiescent in the face of heaped indignities that we are beset with. We're informed from the 1980s that you may be fired for trying to form a union. Then you're informed by Walmart that you will be hired part-time and not be given health benefits, and also that this mega store will kill your downtown in your town. And the Americans, and then you're told that the financiers have stolen $2 trillion from you and you're going to have to pay them for that. And then also you will be unemployed and lose your house. And the American public's response to all of this has said, gee, is that so? Okay. Let's vote in the party that caused all this. So it is true that a conflict model of society may not tell us so much about the workings of the United States, but not every society is like the United States. We're big, we're federal, there are all kinds of reasons for which this odd situation exists. We're also very rich. So even if you fire people, they can go live with their families and they can hope to get back on their feet and so forth. 20% of Egyptians live on $2 a day. Another 20%, which altogether makes 40, live on a little more than $2 a day. So they're just barely making it. And if you give them bad economic news, they're not going to take it well. They're not going to say, oh, gee, is that the way it is? And I would argue that some of the roots of what's happening here go back to those financial crises of 19 I said, I'm old, of 2008 and 2009. Because when the Western Europe and American economies get ill, Egypt catches a cold. Egypt depends heavily on Suez Canal tolls, world trade. About 7.5% of all the trade in the world goes through Egypt. That's a very significant amount. And about 10% of the world's petroleum supplies go through Egypt. So there was a downturn in trade. There was a downturn in petroleum prices in 2008, 2009. Then, Egypt is a country of about 81 million people. The labor force, something like 22, 23 million. 3 million working abroad, a lot of them in the oil states, and making pretty good salaries abroad and sending back remittances. And I think this helps to explain the relative stability in Egypt, because all along nobody liked the government. Like, I lived in Egypt off and on, well, since the 1970s. And once Mubarak came in, you know, when you're in Egypt, you ask people, what do you think about Mubarak? And they all spit. And they've been doing that for years, I mean, for decades. So I never heard anybody say, oh, you know, he's doing such a great job. And you wonder to yourself, well, why is he still there if he's so universally disliked? And I think there was a safety valve, that if you got down on your luck and you had no hope, well, there was always Kuwait. And one of the things that happened in 2008 and 2009 is that the world took Kuwait away. The price of petroleum in 2009, I mean, it went from $140 a barrel at one point in 2008, right? Way down to more like an average of 50, and sometimes dipped way down to the 30s. So the oil workers got fired, or they weren't given as much work, and they couldn't send back remittances, or they had to show up back home in humiliation. And I think that economic downturn in the world that took away so much opportunity for Egyptians who were just barely making it anyway, contributed to their despair. It's also clear that Egyptians are socially mobilizing. Now, Karl Deutsch and other political scientists came up with this idea of social mobilization. And what they mean by that is, people are moving from villages to the city, people are getting jobs in factories. And one of the things that cities and factories do for you is that it allows you to organize. Egyptian peasants are not very organized, and peasant villages are distant from one another, and peasants are under the thumb of the larger, of the medium farmers. In Egypt, they had land reform, so there aren't these huge haciendas anymore, but there's still a rural middle class. And Lenny Binder argued that the rural middle class created by this military regime, which came into power in 1952, and which did land reform and destroyed the old landed class, and created a rural middle class, also created a constituency for itself. So the rural middle class was very loyal to the regime. But those people who came into the city and got factory jobs in textile factories, or the young people who've been to Cairo University and are unemployed, and there's very high rates of unemployed among the college graduates, they don't have any loyalty to the regime. And then in the last couple years, their opportunities for other forms of employment and even abroad have been much curtailed. So I think the economic downturn we've seen, which was the fault of some people down the street here in the last couple years, really played a very major role in depriving people of hope. And when people don't have hope, if they don't have some safety valve, then they are really forced to look at their circumstances and perhaps to try to change them. And so in 2008, you had the beginnings of this movement were with an attempted textile strike in Al-Mahalla al-Kubra, which used to be a separate town, but is increasingly being engorged by Cairo. And it was textile workers that wanted to strike, and they were supported by educated young people of a progressive bent. And the regime intervened to stop it. They lined the streets with riot police, with the shields and the mirror glasses, and they had batons, and they beat people, they arrested people in the middle of the night, and they broke that strike. But it was to be on April 6th of 2008. The April 6th committee survived, and they were the ones that called for the January 25th demonstration in emulation of the Tunisians. And one of the things that had happened was that this Tunisian popular revolt, which caused the president to resign and to flee, gave the Egyptians the hope that if just enough of them kept coming out into the streets and wishing this regime away, eventually they would so cripple the economy, they would so discourage the hardliners that they could effect political change and make for an opening. It is a horrible, oppressive regime. People were tired of it, and that's why they were setting fire to police stations. Not that they're anarchistic. The police were torturing them and arresting them for no good reason. So this is a labor movement. It is a set of labor movements. And it's not noticeably about Islam. If you look at the slogans, people are not saying, Al-Islam huwa al-hal, which is the old Muslim Brotherhood slogan, that Islam is the answer. They seem to be saying, a living wage is the answer. An end to the police state is the answer. It's remarkable how the keywords of this revolution are the nation, the people, the army. It's secular Egyptian nationalism that's at the center of this, but inflected by a demand for an equitable society for workers. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thanks to Columbia. It's a great honor, and I'm quite proud of being here tonight. It's certainly the second best place to be after Tahrir Square. So I'm not only French with the accent you already spotted, but I also speak quite low. So I hope the microphone is loud enough. Is it okay? Yes? Okay. So I'm certainly no match for the scholarship and expertise of the other people on that stage. My colleagues know far more than me about those issues in the Arab world, where basically I have friends. They are my pride, they are my joy, and they taught me everything I know about the Arab world. And one of these friends died on Saturday, not on Liberation Square, but in Damascus. Omar Amir Alai was not only one of the most gifted filmmakers of his generation, he was a strong activist for liberty and freedom. He documented during more than 30 years the reality of the Ba'ath regime in Syria. And I spent with him hours and nights when he was harassed by the not-so-secret Mukhabarat police, when his family was threatened and his passport taken, and so on and so forth. Omar and I had many common friends. One of them, Samir Kassir, was killed in a booby-trapped car on June 2nd, 2005 in Beirut for being one of the leaders of the pro-democracy movement in Lebanon. That was the end of the Spring of Beirut, the same way Omar had been one of the driving force in the Spring of Damascus 5 years before. And Omar Amir Alai's last public gesture was, on January 30, the signing of a manifesto in Syria supporting the democratic uprising in Tunisia and Egypt. So the Spring of Damascus and the Spring of Beirut passed away, and now we have a spring in winter, well, not in New York, the Spring of Tunis and Cairo. I was in Cairo on that now famous date, April 6, 2008, when everybody spoke about this strange Facebook group calling for a strike. And of course, there was the real strike, the working class strike that Juan told us about in Mahal al-Kubra and Shubra. But there was also a virtual strike because basically nobody was striking, but the city just went down because everybody was expecting the strike and the police took over. So you could drive from downtown Cairo to the airport in a quarter of an hour, which is, as everybody knows, quite a feat. But 3 days after the strike, there were elections, municipal elections. And my good friends who know told me that the turnout was less than 1%. So where was the virtual world? On Facebook or with the electoral farce? I was in Cairo last June, invited by L'Ahram to speak. Well, what I wanted to speak about was the end of jihad. They say, maybe sensitive. نهاية عصر الجهاد. So they say, ما بعد الراديكالية السياسية. What's after political radicalism? And of course, they were much wiser than me. Because I hope I'm not too much out of space with the precedent talk. The whole thing is also about what is post-radicalism. And at least with the jihadis, it's clear. And there were, in my talk, it was packed full, a little bit more like here, but the population was very different. It was basically former jihadis. From the Jamaat, from El-Ghobashy al-Islami, all the lot. Of course, they had been through a lot of things, but basically, they had discovered, understood, at last, that this was a failure. It didn't work. And so they gave me, nearly each one of them, the treatise he wrote to explain why jihad was wrong while still being a good, faithful, so and so. So I came back to France with my little library in my suitcase of jihadi, anti-jihadi treaties. And so the jihadis, Al-Qaeda, a matter of interest in this city. It's a catastrophe what's taking place for them. So they're silent. They don't say a word. Even Zawahiri, bin Laden's deputy, who is Egyptian, who is ready to speak about anything going on in the world at any moment. Because for them, this is the end of everything they taught and professed. They see the Arab street, the Muslim masses demonstrating, like Juan recalled us, about democracy, free elections, transparency, accountability. Nothing about the global caliphate. Nothing about the Islamic State. So they don't say a word, because when they speak, it's worst. 2 days ago, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, through its Ministry of War, delivered a vicious attack on everything the protesters in Egypt are struggling for. Beware of the tricks of un-Islamic ideologies, such as filthy and evil secularism, infidel democracy, the putrid idolatry of patriotism and nationalism. But, the climax was when they wrote, do not replace better with worst. So, obviously, you see where they stand. Al-Qaeda is betting on a reversal of the political scales. A violent deterioration of the climate in Egypt that would lead to a widespread restoration of the authoritarian regimes and their repressive apparatus would give Al-Qaeda the possibility to re-harness its revolutionary propaganda and to launch again some kind of a terror campaign. The symbols of the democratic movement could then be targeted to deepen the confrontation dynamics. There is no clear long-term correlation to be expected between the policy of democratic assertion and the consolidation of the Islamist current. But any counter-revolutionary campaign that would brutally roll back the peaceful protest would inevitably benefit the jihadis. Al-Qaeda knows it and prays for it to happen. And this could be taken into consideration by some policymakers. So I'm not a reformed jihadist, but I hope to be soon a reformed jihadi website monitors, because I'm really fed up with it. Abu Basir Tartusi, Abu Kalib al-Fulani, I can't. It's over. It's too much. And, I'm not so much with the new media. I'm French, so imagine how archaic I am. But really, now, I'm getting to love Facebook. Huh? I'm so happy to see the topic of years of research, and including 3 books, just fading away, becoming obsolete. Bye-bye, jihadis. Time is over. Game is over also for you. I hope. And about, this regional approach. So again, I have to rely on Facebook, because in many countries it's not as open as it is now in Egypt. So you know maybe that tomorrow, February 11th, there is Thawrat el-Karama, Revolution of Dignity, that has been called by a Facebook group in Gaza, and of course using Karama, which is a symbol of one of the founding battle of Palestinian nationalism, is very important. We'll see, because we saw before that Days of Rage have been called on Facebook in Syria, for example, and nothing happened. February 17, Libya, we'll see. February 20, Morocco, we'll see again. It's on Facebook, anyway. But to make it very clear, I don't believe in any domino effect. I don't believe in a sweeping wave in the region. This is not 89, not because those people are not fighting for the very values that were at the core of the democratic movement in Eastern Europe or in Western Europe or here. This is the same values. But it's not 89 because there's no Soviet Union. There's not an integrated Arab system with, a chief of staff somewhere. There's an Nizam al-Arabi, there's an Arab system, but there's no chain of command. So we are talking about emulation, empowerment with a movement that is fundamentally plural and diverse in every country concerned, and of course among the region. So there will be no grand soir. Even in Tunisia that made it possible, in less than a month. It started with the rural areas. It started with southern Tunisia, with the most disenfranchised and impoverished places. But it broke a taboo, because you have to know, if you don't know yet, that in Tunisia, the presidential party had 2 million members over 10 million population. So the social control was enormous, incredible. And there was no cohesive opposition. But there was, and in that I totally echo, in that and in many things, Juan called, there was a strong union. Union Générale du Travail Tunisien, UGTT. Very well organized all over the country, including the rural areas. And they are probably the one, and it's true, you have very few reports about UGTT. And they are probably the most important force now in the defining the future of Tunisia. And it broke a taboo because it broke the idea of this paternalistic approach, you know, the modernist authoritarianism. Well, anyway, you got the picture. You know, everything you do, it's thanks to me, and you owe it to me. It's over. And of course, in Egypt, there was an emulation through all this. But Egypt is changing totally the dimension, the scale. It's such a magnitude. And everything is still possible, but with no domino effect. I insist on that. That's not the issue. That's not the dynamics. At the same time, there is a saying in France, I don't know in English, saying that fear doesn't give you good advice. No? Nothing like that? No, you don't fear anything here. Happy you. Well, it could be wrong. It could be wrong because the difference between now and before, and it's irreversible. There will be no more absolute impunity for the power and absolute vulnerability for the people. It's over. It's over. So I'll just point out 5 lessons, comments, I don't know. First one is that already the Jamlaka, the Repu monarchy, you know, when like in 2000 in Syria, father dies, son gets the presidency, it's over. It's over in Egypt, it's over in Yemen, it's probably over in Libya. It's over. Because they were ready for it. They were already preparing everything for it. Second is that probably life presidency is also over. The idea of 1 mandate, 2 mandates, 3 mandates, like that. And that probably, and I must pay tribute to Professor Stefan for that, parliamentarism will be the name of the game, which at the same time is very important from the point of view of the Arab world because it's not anymore about Zaim or Rais, the leader, that you have to devote your life, give your soul and blood, biruh, bidam. There have been very rude comments about the democratic movement being leaderless, amorphous. Well, wonderful. Hooray! I love that. Because it has been at the same time very disciplined, very organized. And you know what it implies to have hundreds of thousands of people and keep calm and keep water and keep food and have, you know, clinic and things like that. They know how to get organized and they should be very much respected for that. And violence came from the Baltagia, came from the thugs, from the regime. And even recently in Western Tunisia, it has been discovered that the recent attack was from gangs that are still from the regime. Then I will go very quickly for a very complicated issue, just bullet points. I think the third consequence is probably that the Muslim Brotherhood will adopt one way or another the Turkish model. Not because they love Erdogan so much, but because the Turks can convince them that after all it's not too bad to have the army around. Because when you don't have the army around, look at Jordan, first vote 89, the Brotherhood takes the majority, second vote 93, because of course they behaved like good Muslim brothers, I'm sorry to say, I should not joke. So they failed and they lost because they are not very good managers, they are not very good ministers, okay? While in Turkey, you can always blame it on the army. Everything good, it's for the Islamists. Everything bad is for the military. And then every vote, they get more support. So I think that it could work. Fourth point is, of course, about money, about rent. The rent that is distributed and plundered and distributed by the paternalistic authoritarian regime. In Tunisia, it all went in flames because basically there's no oil, there's no natural resources. That means that what is plundered is directly the result of the work of the Tunisian people. And at one moment, too much is too much. And now we see with the oil money that probably a lot will be redirected to buttress the tension in the area just in case. And the last point, of course, is about the youth factor. There is only one Arab exception. It's about demographics. The rest is, forget it. I won't qualify it. The median age in the Arab world is 22. It's 28 in the world. 60% of the population in the Arab world is below 25. And you have what you call the youth bulge, which means that basically the segment between 15 and 24 is the one still growing the fastest despite the demographic transition. And of course, this population is the one that it hits the hardest by unemployment, underemployment, and dequalification. So they are young, they are angry, they have the rage, and they get organized. And the last word is, of course, a lot of people are saying, why does it happen now? Well, I would say, why didn't it happen before? And not because of Wall Street, sorry, but because from the sociological point of view, we are witnessing a catch-up process. You know, I'm from Spanish origin. If you take, you know, Spain in 75, at the death of Franco, from the point of view of middle class, development, women empowerment, higher education, the country was far less advanced than Tunisia today. The whole idea that it should have been postponed more and more was just plain nonsense. And I will therefore close this small talk on this idea that because it's a catch-up process, then it should be only the beginning. Thank you very much.
Mona El-Ghobashy.
Thank you for coming. Good evening. Can you hear me?
Speak a bit closer into the mic.
Can you hear me now? Better. Okay. Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me. It's customary to begin with disclaimers about how one is very honored to be with a panel of guests who are much more distinguished than one, but in my case, it's actually true. I have 3 disclaimers. I'm not a historian. I don't arrogate to myself that kind of honor. I am the only person on this panel that has not written a book. I'm desperately trying to write a book, but I have not written the book. So, and then finally, I am Egyptian, but I'm only occasionally funny. I'm not as funny as the rest of my countrymen, so don't expect good stand-up comedy. Maybe my argument will be comedy. What I'm going to try to do today is to pick up on some of the themes that Juan and Jean-Pierre picked up on. And what I want to do is to present to you an argument, a tentative explanation about what we're seeing in Egypt. Juan invoked the name of someone I love dearly and who trained me at this university and who I miss very much, the much missed and much loved sociologist Charles Tilly. The reason I miss him is not just for personal reasons. I think Chuck would have been one of the few people to have been thoroughly delighted by what's happening right now. He would have been so excited. He would have called us up all to figure out what is happening, to get our takes on what's happening, and also tell us what he thought was happening. There's a great essay that he wrote in 1973. It's called From Mobilization, Does Modernization Lead to Revolution? And that essay came on my radar again as I was trying to make sense of what's happening in Egypt. I read it recently. And what I'm going to present to you today, this tentative sort of interpretation or explanation, is very much inspired by Chuck's piece, Does Modernization Breed Revolution? By the way, for those of you who aren't familiar with his work, this is where he sketched out one of the beginnings of him sketching his very kind of influential resource mobilization theory. The punchline of that theory that I'm going to try to sort of present to you today by looking at the case of Egypt. And again, because events are moving so quickly, I realize that it takes a lot of hubris to try to hazard any kind of explanation, but that's what political scientists do, unlike historians. The punchline of his thesis, and what I'm going to be arguing now, is that the causes of this revolt and uprising or revolution, however we want to label it, are not economic discontent or grievances. This was the main counter-argument that Chuck was arguing against. What I'm going to be trying to say is that the causes of this revolution are actually political. And I'll explain as we go on. But let me just begin by contextualizing why what we're seeing is so remarkable. I know that everybody in this room realizes the gravity of what we're seeing, but from the perspective of a political scientist and an Egyptian, this is doubly surprising, and here's why. If there was ever going to be an uprising against authoritarian rule, it should never have come from Egypt. Egypt is one of the most durable authoritarian regimes in the world. Depending on when you want to date it, if we date it from 1952, when the military intervention in politics began and set up this very durable authoritarianism, or if you begin from 1977 or wherever you want to date it, this should not have happened here. And the reason it shouldn't have happened in Egypt in particular is because Egypt is not a stereotypical tin pot dictatorship. This is not an Orwellian regime, and neither is it a regime that survives by coercion alone. That's the secret of its durability. It's because it has this very shrewd mixture of open institutions and closed institutions. A lot of political scientists are now investigating this phenomenon of hybrid regimes, of which Egypt is an excellent exemplar. And what political scientists are trying to figure out is why these regimes are so durable. Why do they exist? First of all, if there is so much public discontent, there is no doubt that Egyptians have been spitting on Mubarak since 1993, when he ran for a third term after saying that he wouldn't run for more than 1 or 2 terms. So there is no mystification among this population of how much they don't like the president and disagree with his policies and disagree with his person. There's also no shortage of economic grievances in this country. But those grievances, yes, they have been mounting. Yes, 2008 was the peak when there was a worldwide global recession and crisis in food prices. We should have seen some sort of a similar cataclysm in 2008, but certainly not in 2011. There are a couple of other sort of bullet point reasons I want to run down for you that explain this extraordinarily durable regime. Again, for political scientists, they had sort of figured out Egypt. Egypt was a very predictable country. The formula of its politics was basically the iron triangle between a superly powerful president, backed by a professional and well-resourced military, and presiding over a society that is complex, full of interest associations, but ultimately unable and has never been able to challenge or pose any real challenge to the power of the regime. How did this system survive until January 28th, 2011? It's still very much in place. I'm not heralding the demise of the system, because if we saw anything today, it was precisely this pattern, that Mubarak is no Ben Ali. This is not a man who's going to get on a plane and leave the country. this has far deeper roots, and what I was going to try to explain to you is how it survived and why we might be looking at those very sources of survival for clues about why it seems to be on the verge of some sort of massive transformation, if not collapse. Okay. The shrewd mixture of institutions is as follows. Egypt, again, is a country that has a patchwork of real institutions. One of these is a semi-independent judiciary. This is a real judiciary. And not only is it a real judiciary, but it actually has turned into a venue for citizens seeking recourse against all sorts of abuses. Abuses by the police, abuses by other executive agents, by bureaucrats. It's also turned into a mechanism to express their political grievances by filing lawsuits against government officials. Judges have also taken a corporate stance for democracy. They did this in 2006, and there were massive protests in the streets. The Christian Science Monitor, I'll never forget, at the time, wrote an editorial that was titled, you can still find it on Google, "All Stand for Egypt's Judges." This was a very heroic movement that really captured the imagination of the international press and many people inside and outside Egypt. So there is a real functioning judiciary, but with restrictions on what it can do. There's a parliament. It is a rubber stamp parliament, but historically it has always had some measure of opposition representation. That was key to Mubarak's strategy of rule. In fact, Mubarak was seen as a particularly shrewd despot because he always allowed a margin of interest representation in a legislature that, while not real, this is not a democratic legislature, but it was also not a laughingstock. It was a place for debates. People did try to table bills. You at least had a sense of, political personalities rising up in the legislature. Some people made their mark in Egypt and became sort of political stars through the route of this limited legislature. So it was a limited legislature, not a laughingstock, but not a real parliament either. The media has received a lot of attention. The media market in Egypt over the past 15 years has really developed into a very vibrant, semi-competitive institution that has lots of independent newspapers vying with each other, then the introduction of satellite channels. So there's actually quite a vibrant press, and for the past 10 years, this press has been the main source of very vicious critiques against the Mubarak ruling formula. It's gotten to the point where in 2005, the press and a whole bunch of other civil society organizations began a movement that targeted Mubarak personally, a movement that withered Mubarak in the most undecorous, rude terms. And again, that was seen as a sign of yet the more shrewd incorporation by the president, that instead of throwing all of these people in jail, he lets them scream on the street corner and say whatever it is that they want to say, even if what they say is, Mubarak, please leave, please, we want you out, and we don't want your son. So the media field also absorbed these kinds of grievances and the image that Juan mentioned of the safety valve. There's a lot of safety valves. Finally, starting in 2000, a lot of observers noticed that there were a rising tide of strikes that were increasing in frequency, in scale, and also in the range of the groups of the population that engaged in strikes and protests. Now, many people in the beginning, when they looked at these strikes, they looked for two things. Were they political? Did they target the president? The other thing they looked for was how was the regime, or how threatening were they to the regime? And it soon became very clear, particularly after the containment, the successful containment of the April 6, 2008 uprising, is that these protests are actually yet another shrewd mechanism by the regime to absorb popular discontent. It never posed a threat to the Mubarak formula, ever. Even the largest protests, the 35,000 textile strike in Mahalla in 2007, the real estate workers strike, where real estate civil servants, these are actual bureaucrats who collect real estate taxes for the government. So they're government employees. They staged a very dramatic work strike across the entire country and an 11-day sit-in in the capital city, and they extracted not only serious concessions from the government, but it led to the formation of the first independent trade union in Egypt since 1957. The regime was able to absorb that too. So there was nothing that this regime could not conquer. It really was extraordinary, again, not because of its brute force, although it had plenty of that. There are 1.4 million conscripts and police officers, riot police and so on, designed specifically to control the domestic population. So it certainly has a very rigorous control apparatus, but it's the mixture of repression and incorporation that makes this regime so powerful and also makes what we're witnessing completely unpredictable, unexpected. Nobody could have foreseen it. Okay? I want to add just two historical notes. I'm not a historian, but I know that these things happened. The other reason that we are so surprised and shocked by what's happening is that both of Mubarak's predecessors faced what looked to be very massive, almost proto-revolutionary uprisings, and they also were handily dealt with by the previous presidents. In 1968, as part of the global wave of protests sweeping the globe at that time, there was an Egyptian version of 68. This was after Nasser's defeat, and Nasser was at his weakest. This was one of the most powerful leaders in the world at the time. He had been defeated in the Six-Day War with Israel, and so his legitimacy was seriously dented. And in 1968, in reaction to a trigger event, this was the very lenient sentences that were given out to Air Force officers who were being tried for the failure to protect the country's borders and the defeat by Israel. They were given very lenient sentences. So almost simultaneously and very similar to what we saw on January 25th, workers and students went out in droves over the entire country and rioted for 3 days against the lenient sentences, against the corruption, and many people took it to be the biggest challenge that Gamal Abdel Nasser had ever faced in domestic politics. But he handily incorporated that too. He came out with a program that was later called the March 30th, 1968 program, in which he gave a few concessions to the rioting population. What was clear was that the 68 protests never posed a threat to Gamal Abdel Nasser himself, neither did they pose a threat to the system that he built. This system had just re-energized its legitimacy after 67. And he was, again, using this shrewd mix of concession and repression, was able to incorporate it. His successor, Anwar Sadat, also faced something that looked to be very serious and that threatened his rule in 1977, bread riots in Egypt on January the 18th and 19th, 1977, one of the earliest waves of global food riots against what were the earlier the forebears of the structural adjustment programs. Rioting extended from all the way to Alexandria, all the way to Aswan. The entire country was gripped by rioting. People were destroying all visible elements of state power, but also they targeted the vice president's house. Of course, the vice president at the time was none other than Hosni Mubarak. They stormed his house in Alexandria, burned it to the ground. But this challenge, again, was handily dealt with by the regime. What they did was basically very quickly reinstate the subsidies that had angered people so much. The lifting of the subsidies had angered them. Reinstated the subsidies. Sadat went on a speaking tour with various citizen negotiations and sort of tried to make nice. And he weathered that serious challenge. And what's crucial here again, just as in 68, those popular upheavals never really targeted either the president himself nor the political system that he had built. So what is it about 2011 that is so incredible? But how did it happen? How did this happen if, again, the condition of economic grievances has been pretty much constant, if not increasing, since 2008? Unemployment, all the indicators, unemployment, poverty, income inequality, all of those are either constant or rising. But they still are insufficient to explain what we're seeing. 5 minutes. My explanation is as follows. It has to do with the ways in which the regime is constricting that formula. Remember, the formula was always between repression and co-optation. In the past 2 years especially, the Mubarak regime has actually systematically closed down all of those channels that used to exist to absorb popular grievances. And what I want to point to are two incidents. They weren't immediate triggers, but they're very important incidents for us to understand what is happening on the ground today. The first was the killing of a young man, a young, very clean-cut, middle-class man in Alexandria by the police in broad daylight. They beat him to death. This galvanized the country, and it received much international attention. His name is Khalid Said. And he was beaten by police in broad daylight. He was pulled out of an internet cafe by 2 plainclothes policemen. And the role of a plainclothes policeman in Egypt, as you all know by now, is actually quite crucial in the state's repressive apparatus. And they brutally killed him because he had posted a YouTube video showing those 2 police officers divvying up money from a drug bust. Okay. And that kind of revenge killing galvanized the country, not because the police hadn't killed citizens before, but because this particular citizen was particularly poignant. Just like El-Ghobashy, the Google executive, 2 days ago when he talked and sort of brought more people out on the street. This young man was incredibly clear-cut, had probably the most innocent face you have ever seen. And many people identified with him. And out of that incident, El-Ghobashy, the Google executive, started the group that is called We Are All Khalid Said. And that group was the main organizing vehicle. Along with April 6th, they organized the January 25th Police Day strike. Okay. The key, again, is the notion of identification with a young man whose middle class comes from a good family. This is not the sector of society that's usually targeted by the police. These people are respectable middle class people. They weren't necessarily involved in politics, but many people could identify with the sense of injustice, and really the feeling was the police force had become completely out of control, and they could target me. They could target people who aren't necessarily involved in politics, who just, want to live. The other incident that showed to people, or narrowed, or somehow crystallized, that the mechanisms of rule were constricting around the population in this kind of vise, are the stolen elections of November, December 2010, the parliamentary elections. Now, what's so surprising about stolen parliamentary elections in Egypt? Egypt equals stolen parliamentary elections, ever since 1976, and that is real. What is it about the 2010 elections that galvanized people so much? I think partly, again, it was this accumulation of grievances. It was the growing realization that the police had the population in a stranglehold. Remember, in Egypt, the police really is the main executive agency that deals with all sorts of urban and rural, any kind of collective action. It's not the municipal structures. Those don't exist, and they are corrupt and completely futile. But literally anything that happens, a disaster, a protest, a riot, anything, the first responders are always the police. And why are they there? They're there to contain the people, not to help the people in any way, shape, or form. And so those kinds of repeated, constant, over and over again, the repeated interactions between people and police, the stolen elections in which the police played the major role. The elections were particularly egregious because, for the first time, the ruling party, instead of giving the quarter of the seats in parliament, a little bit of crumbs to the opposition, they hogged the entire parliament. 97% of the seats. They just took it in one fell swoop. And they had the temerity to then act as if they won in a fair contest. This was what also outraged people. The elections left a documentary record on YouTube. I'd love to send you some links of the actual rigging on the ground that happened in polling stations, the violence. I was in a provincial town in Egypt, and I saw what it meant for people to have their election be stolen. Because Egyptians have no illusions at the lack of power of parliament. They have no illusions at the futility of some of these elections. But what they do realize is that they need representatives in national institutions, because those representatives are the only way that they're going to have any chance at getting any kind of state services for their districts. It's as simple as that. And when I saw people react to the stealing of their election in their district, it was really palpable. I did not think that people understood elections to be that important. Again, they don't think that elections are going to lead to democracy the next day, but it is, again, the only source of linkage between a population that, as you all know, the picture of the population is very clear, and a political system that's growing much more restricted, further from the population, monopolizing national resources, and also refusing to let the population even express its discontent. Where are you going to express your grievances if not in parliament? They shut down parliament, shut down the professional associations. So this picture of the widening repression and lessening of channels of grievances and the limited interest representation, when you put those two things together, and then you add the final ingredient of the police's behavior on January 25th, in which they used force, which is nothing new, but by that point, the population really had come to the proverbial point of being fed up, and through a series of actual interactions on the ground between police and protesters, this conflagration that never started as a popular upheaval became something that looks very much like a revolutionary situation. Thank you.